Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. Our guest today is Dr. Marcia Bjornerud, a geologist. Her most recent book, Turning to Stone, Discovering the Subtle Wisdom of Rocks, tells us the story of how our planet has evolved and reinvented itself. What do rocks tell us about the world we live in today and the world we inherited over millions of years? I caught up with Dr. Bjornerud to learn more. Thank you very much, Dr. Marcia Bjornerud, for joining in to talk with me.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Abhishek.
Thank you, and many congratulations on the book, which I've enjoyed reading. And it's saying something because I have a background in commerce and then a degree in management, and geology and what I have studied is both mutually exclusive. So you've written in a way that common folks can understand. Let's start with you chastising yourself for being a rock snob at some point. You mentioned that in the book. Where did it all begin? If you could dig back into your childhood and tell us.
Well, I think like many children, I did have some kind of affinity for picking up pretty pebbles and musing about them. But unfortunately, at least in this country, maybe in India, you have a more enlightened science curriculum. Geosciences are just not represented in the schools in any rigorous sort of way. So although I think I had some sort of latent geological instincts, they were never really nurtured or fostered until really only to fulfill a laboratory science requirement as a first-year university student. I happened to take a geology class, and that childlike interest in the solid earth was reawakened, and I realized that the geosciences had just such great explanatory power. They're not just about identifying rocks and minerals. Those are just sort of the vocabulary words of the language of the earth. But the geosciences are a worldview, a way of seeing in 4 dimensions, including time. And that was just such a mind-expanding thing that I got hooked.
And in the 70s, where you grew up in rural Wisconsin, sorry, and you say that you were, quote, an odd and awkward girl who found trees and stones to be good companions. So it started early then.
I think so. Yes, I grew up in a very sort of remote, unpopulated place near Lake Superior in the northern part of the United States. And I realize now I was very lucky in that sense. It was a place where children could just run freely in the woods and get unstructured lessons in science directly from nature. But again, partly because of the era that I grew up in, there weren't many women scientists to be mentors to me. And as I said, geology just I wasn't really aware of it as a discipline, a rigorous sort of pursuit until I was in university.
Did it also help that your interest in language, because that's what you wanted to do initially, is what you say right in your book, that you wanted to major in languages or linguistics to become a translator as well, and obviously your love for the language shines through the books that you've done so far. Is that something that helps you translate the mystery of a subject which not everybody can do, let's face it?
So, yeah, as you say, I really entered university thinking I wanted to go into linguistics or something, largely because I loved word etymologies, the origins of words, and how they shine a light on earlier ways of thinking. A familiar word, you sort of unpack it, and then you see its deep origins, and it's just this epiphany, like, oh, wow, that's what that originally meant, and then you see how it's evolved. And so I think one of the original attractions to me of geoscience was actually the incredibly eclectic lexicon of geology, which can be off-putting to many students, I realize. Just so many rock and mineral names. There are just so many words, but I love the way they've just sampled from all over the world. The words describing rocks are themselves full of history. But then I began to realize that the rocks themselves were texts of a kind that could be read. And in some ways, geology, I've said, is the etymology of the whole world. It explains how things came to be the way they are. And I think that's what is so appealing for those of us in the field. It gives us a deep understanding of the logic of the world.
And that's why you maintain in the book on 2 or 3 occasions that rocks are sentient beings, or that's how you write them as, and even ice, air, glaciers, mountains, and they talk back to us if we are willing to listen. Can you give a couple of examples in that realm? How does this add up? What did the rocks say that you listened when you were in your 20s and it blew your mind?
Well, I do want to acknowledge that I'm venturing a little bit into dangerous territory there as a scientist.
Okay.
Animism and certainly anthropomorphism are things that we are not generally allowed to do in the sciences. But I think in some rigorous scientific way, it could be said that rocks, despite their reputations for being inert, unresponsive, are in a sense alert and responsive, and in that sense sentient. I'm not talking about a subjective understanding of themselves, but they're not simply lumps sitting there doing nothing. They're very ancient rocks, if exposed to the surface, are interacting with today's atmosphere or yesterday's rain. They are responsive and part of, the incredibly complex, interconnected neuron-like systems that keep the Earth going, that include the solid Earth, hydrosphere, atmosphere, the biosphere. So in that sense, I want to emphasize I'm not venturing into new agey territory here, but I'm trying to disavow people of the idea that the solid Earth is unresponsive, because it's not.
Right. So the phrase in English which says, "Don't just stand there like a rock." If you were to tell a 5-year-old, he might retort.
Exactly. Rocks are on the move. I mean, my field is structural geology, so it has to do with mountain building processes, and of course, the Himalaya are the premier example. Those are rocks that have moved a long way. Many of them were on the deep seafloor. Now they're at the tallest peaks. They've been crumpled. They've flowed in the solid state. Rocks are very much animate in that sense. My whole field is predicated on the understanding that rocks are on the move all the time as the plates move, and so yeah, all of these idioms that have to do with rocks being completely inert are quite inaccurate in my view.
Yes, and talking about idioms, I think your book also, to make it easy, I'd like to know from you. There are lots of metaphors in the book where, for instance, one of the, I'm quoting, the volcano was monitored like a patient in a hospital, its vital signs carefully recorded around the clock. Or ocean crust has an entirely predictable life, like a child destined to carry on a generation old family business. Now, this is very clearly not a boring textbook. And when I say boring, the subject to the layman is a little difficult to grasp. Now, does this come from that adolescent love for the language? You talked about idioms, similarly these metaphors. You also write that the austerity of the Arctic has no place for euphemism or artifice, which is not there in your book as well. So tell us about that, the process of writing, before we get into the subject of the book itself.
Yeah, that's very perceptive. And I think some of those metaphors emerge out of my experience as a teacher. I'm a professor at a undergraduate college, and so over the years have had to try to find ways of explaining things, often to sort of science phobic students. So I teach here at what we call a liberal arts college, where students often enter not knowing what they're going to go into, and so I myself found my way into science not thinking that that was my path. So I want to make sure that I'm welcoming people in. And so some of the ways of explaining things have emerged quite naturally from my teaching. But I also think that metaphor can be, it's not necessarily something that I would use in a scientific article writing for other scientists, but I think it can be very rigorous. I hold a very high standard for myself to not dumb down the science or not misrepresent the science. And I use these metaphors carefully when I think that they'll be helpful as kind of portals for people into subtler ideas. So I demand a lot of the reader. I want to introduce quite nuanced ideas, and these metaphors I hope are helpful.
Also, the simplicity of it all. A moment ago, you explained yourself how, when you say sentient, it is not about they having feelings, but for us to know something about the past. And this line is quite simple, but says a lot. The present is the key to the past. Can you explain that with a couple of examples of how, whether it's trees or rocks or mountains, volcanoes, can tell us something about prehistoric age even?
So that soundbite, the present is the key to the past, is usually the way that we describe the foundational idea in the geosciences, which is uniformitarianism. It's a terribly long word, but it's a simple idea that we should, when we are trying to understand the rock record, we should look around us at the present day and see what processes are happening and use those as the basis for interpretation of rocks and not invoke supernatural explanations. So we see a sandstone and we could look to modern beaches and say that's a possible environment where those sands could have been laid down. And it's so simple it almost doesn't bear explaining, but at least in the West it was a radical idea in the early 19th century when the Bible was still being looked to as the history of the world. And even people who were doing what now we would call geology were sometimes invoking things like the flood of Noah to explain deep canyons, or the fact that you sometimes saw seashells high up in the mountains. And so these were catastrophic explanations for geologic phenomena. And the idea of uniformitarianism was that no, if we look around us, we can see these gradual processes that over time can build up strata or carve canyons. For probably 150 years, the idea of uniformitarianism was conflated with gradualism, which is the idea that you should only invoke very slow, incremental processes to explain the rock record. And it wasn't until 1980 when the extinction of the dinosaurs was pinned to a meteorite impact event, quite a catastrophic thing, one very bad day, that this idea that, okay, sometimes there are catastrophic events. They don't violate uniformitarianism, but not everything in Earth's past or future is going to be a gradual incremental process. So that was a huge paradigm shift for geologists to accept that sometimes bad things happen to a good planet suddenly. And this matters because in some ways, especially in the West, because this matters because some ways in the West in particular, we've had to always be looking over our shoulder at biblical literalists who want to think that the world is only 7,000 years old or something and still read the Bible as a scientific work. And so we've inculcated the public with this idea that geologic change is slow and incremental and the Earth isn't responsive. But now the narrative has changed and we're saying actually climate can change quite quickly. And both of these things are true. In the main, luckily, Earth is slow to change, but sometimes systems can change rapidly and there can be tipping points that mean that geologic change can happen at the same time scale as human lifetimes. So all of this it's not just arcane history of science. It really matters, I think, for the public perception of what's happening today.
And when would you say the debates in your field started to have conclusive conclusions, or more and more geologists decided that yes, this is possible? Or because you also write that 1980s is when I think you were at the start of your career, also coincided with lots of discoveries and new things in the field, which meant that all the geologists would have to keep an open mind to accept something that they weren't used to before. So, how was that era back then? And did that help in understanding geology more, and the debates as well, where you had to have an open mind to accept things?
Yeah, I feel lucky that my career has happened to coincide with just the flowering of the geosciences into a much more rigorous and nuanced field. Geology, I think, in the public mind still has the reputation from even Victorian times as kind of a taxonomic science, just classifying rocks and minerals and fossils and things. And that's an artifact of what the field was like right up through around 1970. I mean, it's really kind of incredible now to realize that we did not understand how the solid Earth works, plate tectonics, until the late 1960s. And we did not really have ways of understanding climate change at the scale that we need to, at the kind of decadal scale until the 1980s when ice coring became technologically possible and we could read the record of past climate change from Antarctic and Greenland ice cores. So one of the big messages of my book is that the geosciences are now in a golden age. I would say equivalent to, the early 20th century when the structure of the atom and Einstein's ideas of general relativity were emerging. We're at that kind of stage right now in the geosciences, but the public understanding and exposure to the field has lagged behind, to the detriment of the environment, and I would even say to the psychological health of the average earthling. We
The
don't remember
tectonic,
who we are.
right. If we don't understand the present, we will not know how we got here. The corollary to that may also be true. And you
That's
talked
true.
about the tectonic plate movements and the like, which we only started knowing in the is that also gives us indications of how mountains were built, right? Or how earthquakes happen. So that's an important addition to the literature and science of it all. And it's a huge addition. And that wasn't as far back. And you also say that it was only in 1955 could we actually say how old our planet was. So it's like
Yeah,
my
these
dad was born.
Yeah, these are fundamental things about the planet and really relatively recent discoveries. Yeah.
And since we are on the subject and your career, while it coincided with these glorious scientific discoveries, you also write that you were, quote, small, female, and implausibly young student, or rather person who had finished her PhD at 24 and in a male-dominated profession. How was it, and how much has changed since then? If you were to start your career today, vis-a-vis, back in the day.
Yeah, happily, a lot has changed. It was terrifying and stressful for me because I didn't really have mentors or role models that looked like me.
Hmm.
Of course, youth passes, that one gets older, but it was a hard time, and especially I had 3 children and needed to balance my scientific work and childcare. But happily, I think my field and most of the sciences have become much more demographically diverse, and the science is better off for that because the world is complicated and we need people with different backgrounds. They will see things differently. And so it's not just a matter of fairness, it's actually the science benefits from having more different kinds of humans involved. So we're
Right. And
luckily that's
did you,
better.
right. And do you also see, and this is in any industry, they say that you talked about diversity, but do women bring something to the table? And this is not a sexist kind of a question, but from biological stand or just experience, whether it's creativity or elsewhere, can we look at a problem differently? And to your point of how more and more women getting into the field will help. Could you give an example of how that happens? I'm sure you may not generalize it, but it could be one or two examples in that realm, because that is true of many, even in IT, in technology, which is a very male dominated industry where I am from. Sometimes women have the most creative solutions, and one might say they just happen to be women, but we've never know. It could be because they are women. So I just wanted to ask you, how does geology benefit from having more women in the workplace?
Well, it is very difficult to disentangle, personal anecdotes, and I can't speak statistically. But again, I think that we grow up in a gendered world and we're acculturated in different ways. And so of course we're going to see things differently. We might notice things that someone else just filters out. I do know that because I felt at least that I was an outsider in many of my classrooms. I was the only woman or one of only a few women. I developed a kind of anthropological view of the other people and my professors. So at the same time that I was learning the content, I was observing in a conscious way the practices of the discipline, which I think if you're an insider, you don't do that. And so I paid more attention to what are the ways things are being described, or what are the assumptions that no one seems to be challenging, because I was an outsider. And I think that that's helped me also then convey in my writing. I understand what it feels like to be looking in from the outside a little bit. So I think that, I don't know that this is answering your question, but that's possibly the most salient thing that comes to my mind in my experience as being a minority, at least in the beginning of my career, that it developed this kind of observation of others in the field that's helped me understand the sociology of the science a little bit.
Right. And in the field, of geology, a lot of time is spent on the field, where it not in the classroom. And some of the anecdotes and your experiences are, absolutely. Some of them are hair raising. A few others are amusing. What are the couple of things that come to mind if that's scalded in memory? If you can share a couple of experiences, what does it take to be a geologist on the field who, in terms of the extreme temperature to sharing a sleeping bag for all you know?
Yeah, so I've been lucky to work in some pretty remote parts of the Arctic, in particular, Svalbard, an archipelago north of Norway, and then the very high Canadian Arctic archipelago, as far north as you can go and still be on land, in fact. And in those field seasons, being really left with just a small group of people for 2 months, you get to know people very well. I mean, there's just no hiding who you really are. When people are in these kind of extreme environments, happily, most of the time, I think it brings out the best in people. You realize you need to take care of each other. There's not going to be any help coming, immediately if someone is hurt. And there's, yeah, in the main, those have been really good experiences. Funny things happen, but for the most part, I feel very fortunate. And I think geology is different than, say, a laboratory science. But although I should point out that many geologists do laboratory work these days, but field-based geology is different, that you're really measuring the thing you're studying with your body. If you're looking, as I do, at the way that mountains have formed, and the folds and the faults that have constructed mountain belts, you've got to engage with these things physically in a way that's
Right.
quite different than being in a controlled lab environment. And I think you develop a kind of humility and respect for these things that might be different than, again, if you are conducting an experiment and you have shaped the environment of the observations. When you're doing it in the field, you have to accept the weather as it is and just read the landscape as it presents itself to you.
Sometimes you also have to go in search of a bread knife because that would be missing every morning.
You're referring to one particular companion who was very worried about polar bears attacking our camp at night, although in the Arctic, the sun never sets in the summertime. But still, we might be sleeping and a polar bear could come into the camp and you wouldn't see it. And so one of my colleagues would always take our one bread knife into his tent so he could slash his way out if he needed to at night. But it was a daily irritation. Hey, can we have the bread knife, please?
Right, and you were tasked with scrubbing the utensils because you would do it better than some who didn't really care too much about what was cooked the night before, and you was the same. I mean, some of these things obviously are never covered in textbooks, and it also tells you a bit about yourself. You also talk about how basalt, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, is was responsible for some self doubt because in your early days in your career, you couldn't identify the rock from others, which is the most common rock on the Earth's crust. Were you being too hard on yourself, or what was that about?
Well, I use it as an illustration of the challenges of learning the language of the earth. People think that just mere rock and mineral identification isn't really a very sophisticated skill, but rocks can have all of these different guises. So yes, basalt is the most common rock type on Earth. You have some very famous, infamous basalts, I would say, in the Deccan Plateau area in India. We could talk about that if you want. But yeah, the basalt lines the ocean floors. So it's, the most common rock type, but it can look different. It can have gas bubble holes, or it can be very fine grained. It can be, like pahoehoe, the rubbly or the ropey surface texture of a lava flow. And if water has gotten into it, it can change to different colors. So I use that anecdote, which I remember vividly because I was very embarrassed to reveal my ignorance to my professor, to just reassure people that if they've found it frustrating to learn rock and mineral names, it's because it's a challenging thing and it requires, like learning a language, exposure over and over again.
Can somebody be, sometimes in India, I don't know whether it's the case in the US, oftentimes parents may push their kids into a particular profession for certain reasons. Maybe they were too fascinated with it, or maybe there's money in it, etc. Is geology, for instance, medicine and engineering, people discover that while doing it, meaning the love for it. Can geology be that, or it's too difficult unless you really like rocks? You can't just go and fall in love with it while studying in a classroom. What do you reckon?
Well, I think people do fall in love with geology, and many of my students here and at other universities in the US, I know, are sort of accidental geologists. They come into an introductory class and then realize, I never knew that this way of seeing even existed. So they come into it really for the love of it, which is better than someone who's been set on a course by their parents who want them to become a doctor or lawyer or something. And I think, yeah,
Right.
it's something
So that
people love.
it's something, yes, and you can. It's like arranged marriage where you get married. I mean, again, you get married, and maybe hopefully you start loving the person over
You
time,
start
much like
respecting. Yes.
yes. Because, for instance, there is one that I found interesting. Mysteries like a single zircon crystal can contain the tectonic history of a whole continent, is what you write. Now, I may not understand what a single zircon crystal is. Maybe that's where you can help me here. But the fact that it can contain so much information is fascinating to me.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that has only quite recently been accessible to us. That those zircon crystals, of course, have been there for all this time, but only recently have we had the analytical tools to unlock what they're saying with their isotopes of lead and uranium that keep a very, very high precision record of their age and their tectonic history.
And this technology over time, how has it changed? And how is it helping today vis-a-vis when you were in your 20s and 30s, for instance?
Well, I think two things have changed. One is the conceptual frameworks that we did not have before. So, plate tectonics, as we said, climate science. We didn't have these whole Earth paradigms that would bring together people studying individual components of the Earth system. Before, people were kind of narrow specialists, and these global paradigms have helped us see the Earth as this more holistic organism almost. But then there's been the technological changes, including satellite monitoring. We can actually see the plates moving in real time thanks to satellites. We have much more data about climate, both over the last century, but then also through ice coring and other kinds of records like that. And we have the computational capacity to crunch all that data and make and see patterns and make sense of it. We have geochemical tools, analytical tools that can, read zircon crystals and other, information. Some of the problem holding the geosciences back was conceptual, but it was also technological. We just didn't have the capacity to gather data or analyze the data until, say 25 or 30 years ago.
And is artificial intelligence, which is so much of a buzzword these days in every industry or every profession or function or academic sciences, is that helping geology? It could be classification of rocks, identifying patterns. Is that something that your students are using, for instance, to get to the inference sooner than what you used to?
Our students maybe not quite yet, but certainly industry is using it. AI has become a very powerful tool for locating new mineral resources. Mineral deposits are often sort of idiosyncratic. Each one is a little bit different from the others, but AI is very good at, sifting through huge amounts of data and finding patterns that human eyes might not recognize. The oil industry certainly uses AI very extensively to understand how to correlate rock units. And in planetary exploration, AI is becoming really important too. We have lots of data from Mars, say, and the moons of Jupiter increasingly. So it's a tool that's certainly becoming part of the toolbox of geoscience.
And how is that helping further the cause? Is it that you get to a conclusion sooner than having to wait for it for a while?
Yeah, I suppose that's the thing, that to some extent, some of the labor-intensive processes that human geologists have had to do will be co-opted by AI. But I think that there's no doubt that we will always need humans to understand the context and the deeper history and meaning. The AIs can recognize patterns, but not really the semiotics of the stones.
And earthquakes is something that you cover, and over the years we may have gotten better at understanding how they work, but now that you're talking about technology, will we get better at predicting earthquakes? Because it's awfully difficult is what I understand even today. And why is it so difficult to predict an earthquake. You've been through one, haven't you? Along with your kids as well. Must have been a terrifying experience. I've never had that in India, but talk us through that as well, if you can.
Yeah, I mean, so I do study earthquakes, in particular rocks that record ancient earthquakes and are only physical samples that we can really get our hands on and what happens on a fault surface when an earthquake happens. So yes, we understand much, much more about why earthquakes happen and where they are likely to happen in a probabilistic way. But I do not think that there is any prospect of earthquake prediction in real time, in the sense that we could say, okay, in 2 hours' time, there's going to be an earthquake at this place. Everyone should begin to evacuate or take preparation. We can only be prepared, knowing that there are certain places that are inevitably going to have earthquakes based on past patterns of recurrence. Huge amounts of money were poured into the possibility of earthquake prediction in the 1980s and 1990s in the US and Japan. Many very, very smart people worked on this problem for many years. And I think the
Right.
conclusion has been reached that earthquakes are, they could be triggered at any moment by some, they're always a fault that is at the verge of slipping, but the thing that finally triggers that could be a very trivial thing that can't be predicted. And the best response that we can have as humans is to build better structures that don't kill people in earthquakes and prepare people in earthquake prone areas through infrastructure investment. But real time prediction is probably a fool's game. They are just stochastic, non deterministic phenomena. There has been some advance when an earthquake has started in Japan. I'm not sure exactly which event it was, but proof of concept of using cell phones. As soon as a seismometer detects that an earthquake has happened in a place, cell phone technology can alert people in a few seconds, faster than the P and S waves are going to travel and hit their area, that there was an earthquake, the waves are coming your way, get to a door jam or some stable place. But it's not like hours of notice. It would be seconds of notice once the slip has actually begun, but before the waves reach a particular place.
You yourself write that, don't you? When it happened with you, and I'm trying to furiously move to that page where you write that, is you could sense what was coming next, although it only took a few seconds. As somebody who has been in this profession for long, so it can be done, but it's too late. I mean, there's not enough time for the next wave, or you'll have to explain that to me if I'm making sense, because you could predict what could happen next,
Yeah,
and you
no,
you
that's
got yourself to safety.
yeah. So when an earthquake happens, it's usually, at least 10 kilometers underground. So the waves have to propagate up to the surface, and then they're really propagating outward like in a spherical wave front. And there's distinct types of waves. The first ones to arrive are pressure waves, which are like very powerful sound waves. And those are not too destructive. But then a little bit later, um, devastating S waves, which undulate the ground like a wave, an actual water wave, will arrive. And it's sort of like lightning and thunder. The P waves always arrive first, and then the S waves are later. And the lag time between them gets greater the further you are away from where the earthquake happened. So I was awakened by the P waves, and I thought, ooh, I must get out of bed and get to a safe place. I was in a very old Italian house. Maybe it had withstood many other earthquakes, but I wasn't confident about that, and wanted to get outside and just before the S waves arrived. Those are the ones. And then there can be others that are even more prone to shaking things up, surface waves that arrive still later. So that experience of the earthquake in Italy split my head right down the middle between the intellectual part of me that understood what was happening and the human part of me that was terrified.
And how do you square with that then? Whom do you listen to when
In
that
the end,
happens?
the human.
Yeah, got it. And I know we are at the fag end of the podcast, given that you have to also move. In terms of the book has chapters on different kinds of rocks, from granites to turbi d. Can you help me pronounce that?
Turbidites.
Turbidites. Turbidites. That is the extent of ignorance on this side of the table. Forgive me for that. But when you went deep into writing these, you also weave your personal stories of having encountered them. That itself was an interesting one, because as a reader, I was as curious to know what was happening in your life as a geologist, along with your family, that you briefly give us a glimpse, as much as your interaction with these rocks. How did you set that structure for the book? And it worked for me. Generally, how has it worked for your readers, and what was the planning behind it, Doctor?
Yeah, that's a perceptive question. The book, I hope, is mainly about rocks and how the earth works. That was my purpose in writing it. I wanted to convey to all earthlings that whether you think about rocks or not, they are defining your reality, and this is how your planet works. Here's the physiology of Earth. And I struggled. I had a couple of false starts trying to do that in a non-memoirish format. Became too textbooky. And an editor that I knew suggested to me, "Have you thought of a memoir?" And initially I was really resistant to that. I'm a fairly private person, and I didn't want to put my story out into the world. But I realized that what I was trying to achieve was, again, bringing ordinary people who maybe had no previous exposure to geology into the geologic worldview. So why not use my own deepening understanding as a scientist of the Earth as the scaffolding for this larger story of the way the planet works? And so I hope that comes through in the book, that I start with a relatively simple rock that I grew up on and didn't really understand, and then we go to other rocks that maybe people have never heard of, like turbidites, and how I, as a scientist, immersed myself in their logic. And as I'm getting older, I'm also understanding what time means at the kind of geologic scale as well as the human scale. So I'm taking readers on this kind of journey, pilgrimage, I hope,
Right.
toward something, a wiser way of seeing.
Well, I can attest to the fact that it worked, because where else would we know that the fun that the geologists also have on the field, which I wouldn't have known. For example, there is a little anecdote around, was it a walkie-talkie where there were call signs that you would tell each other, like Alpha, Bravo, but also with geologic terms, like was it pterodactyl and psychometer and the like?
Yeah, we were trying to come up with a confusing radio alphabet that would not be very helpful. So yeah, pterodactyl for P. Yeah, you have to find ways to entertain yourself when you're in a remote place.
Can you spell or rather, what is that long word? Can you pronounce that lung disease caused by inhaling very fine silicate or quartz dust is what I read online. It's a 40.
Yeah, it's pneumono ultramicroscopic silicovolcaniconiosis. It's a performance piece more than a regularly used word, but it took me a day or so to learn to say it.
Lovely. And the last one is, I'd asked this to Dr. Thomas Keck, who won the Nobel for his work in RNA back in 79. And I asked the same to you. What advice would you give to your 25-year-old self now, with hindsight of where you are today, if you could share that?
I think it would be just to say, it's going to be okay. Don't be so stressed. I look back with regret that I wasn't always able to enjoy some of the earlier stages of my scientific career, because I felt that I had to always outperform expectations. So to relax and just be more present.
Interesting. There are at least three occasions in the book where you talk about, I worked at a maniacal pace, and time management probably comes very naturally to you, if I remember that. And you're very, dogged, and to get things done. I mean, sure, that has got you to where it has, but you're saying relaxing a little bit doesn't hurt anybody, is what you say then.
Exactly. Yes.
Right. This is the book. I'm holding it up for those who are on YouTube and watching this, Discovering the Subtle Wisdom of Rocks Turning to Stone. It's a fascinating read. And Dr. Bjornerud, thank you so much for your time on this podcast. It's been a joy talking to you, and loved your work in this book.
Likewise. Thank you so much.